Let your body grow heavy against whatever holds you. Feel the weight of the day beginning to release from your shoulders, from your jaw, from the space behind your eyes. You're safe here, you're warm here, and tonight we're going to travel somewhere very far away, back through the deep corridors of time, to a world that existed long before the first human voice ever whispered into the dark. Tonight we visit the Jurassic world. A world of enormous ferns and ancient rivers, a world where the air itself was thicker, richer, more alive than anything you have ever breathed. A world where great creatures moved through forest and swamp and open plain, not with malice, not with cruelty, but simply with the ancient and unhurried purpose of living. The stories we share tonight are stories of predators, but do not let that word tighten your chest. Because here, in the language of deep time, a predator is simply a creature perfectly shaped by millions of years of patient evolution, magnificent, purposeful, and in their own way, deeply, profoundly at peace with the world they inhabit. So breathe slowly now. Let the sounds of the ancient world begin to drift around you, the rustling of prehistoric ferns, the distant call of something enormous and unhurried, the low hum of a world that has been turning long before us and will turn long after. Close your eyes. We are going back. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. There is a particular quality to darkness just before the first light arrives. Not the deep, impenetrable black of true midnight, but a softer, more yielding shade. A darkness that has already begun to thin at its edges, already begun to loosen its grip on the land below. This is the hour that belongs to neither night nor day, the hour when the world holds its breath between one state of being and another. In the Jurassic period, 150 million years before the first human eye opened onto any sunrise, this transitional hour was particularly sacred. The Great Morrison Formation, a vast ancient landscape stretching across what would one day become the western interior of North America, lay draped in this pre-dawn quiet like an enormous creature at rest. The land rolled in long, gentle undulations. Broad floodplains stretched between low, forested ridgelines. Ancient rivers wound through the terrain in slow, deliberate curves, their surfaces perfectly still in the breathless air of the early morning, reflecting the last stars as they faded one by one into an emerging sky of the deepest, most tender blue. The trees were different here. Not the oaks and maples and birches you might know from an autumn morning walk. These were older shapes, stranger shapes. Cycads with their thick palm-like trunks and feathered crowns, Araucarian conifers rising 60, 70, 80 feet into the pale sky, their upper branches spread wide to catch the first warmth of a sun not yet risen. Tree ferns clustered in the lower spaces, their fronds uncurling in the humidity, dew-heavy and motionless in the still air. Horsetails grew dense along the river margins, their segmented stalks standing as straight and regular as the columns of some ancient unroofed temple. And between all of it, the ferns and cycads and towering conifers, the sounds of a world waking. Not all at once, never all at once in the Jurassic dawn. It began with small things, a single insect, somewhere deep in the undergrowth beginning its rhythmic call, then another, in a slightly different register. Then the soft rustle of something small moving through leaf litter, a tiny mammal, no larger than a shrew, picking its delicate way between the bases of ancient fern stalks in search of the night's last insects. The mammals of the Jurassic were humble creatures, secretive, small. They moved only in the margins of the great world, in the spaces between the feet of giants. But the giants were there too, even in this pale pre-dawn hour. If you stood at the edge of one of those broad river plains and let your eyes adjust to the thinning dark, you would begin to make out shapes, large shapes. Shapes that moved with a slowness and a certainty that spoke of great size and perfect security in their own place in the world. There, along the far tree line, the long arching neck of a sauropod, rising above the canopy like the slow sweep of a lighthouse beam. The creature was enormous, its neck alone stretched 40 feet from the base of its barrel-like body to the small, graceful head at its apex. It moved in a long, unhurried sweep, browsing the high branches of an Araucarian conifer with the same meditative patience with which a very old person might turn the pages of a beloved book. There was no urgency in it, no anxiety, only the deep, ancient rhythm of hunger being quietly, peacefully satisfied. The sauropod was not alone. Across the plain, in small family groupings and loose herds, others of its kind were beginning to stir. Their massive bodies moved through the pre-dawn dimness like walking hills, slow, enormous, generating a ground-trembling rumble with each footfall that you would feel in the soles of your feet and the base of your chest rather than hear with your ears, the sound of great things at peace. Steam rose from the river as the air temperature began its subtle shift from the night's cool into the warmth the approaching sun would bring. The river itself was wide and shallow here, braided across a broad flat bed of pale sand and rounded stones. It moved slowly, without hurry, the way all ancient things move, with the confidence of something that has all the time in the world. Fish moved beneath its surface. Enormous dragonflies, their wingspans as wide as your hand, hovered motionless above the current in the windless air before vanishing into the bankside vegetation with a sound like the snapping of a flag. In the trees above the river, something else was waking. Small feathered shapes, early birds, or creatures so close to birds that the distinction would have meant nothing to them, shifted on their perches, ruffling against the morning damp. They were strange-looking things by the standards of any world you know. Some had teeth in their small, delicate beaks. Some had clawed fingers at the mid-joint of their wings, vestigial remnants of the theropod ancestry they had so recently left behind. But their calls were already entirely, unmistakably avian, thin, high, piercingly sweet notes that floated out across the river plain and dissolved into the enormous quiet of the Jurassic dawn like smoke into open sky. And then very slowly the sun. It appeared first as nothing more than a faint brightening at the eastern horizon, a warm amber wash spreading upward through the blue, washing the undersides of a few high clouds in shades of apricot and rose. The sauropods paused in their browsing, turning their long necks toward this familiar warmth with the patient recognition of creatures who had watched this same sunrise 10,000 times before. The insect chorus swelled. The feathered things in the trees above the river began to call in earnest. The Jurassic world woke up. And standing at the edge of a low ridge overlooking all of this, the river, the plain, the browsing herds, the pink-lit sky, was the predator. She had been there since before midnight. The Allosaurus was a large female, old enough to carry the histories of 100 hunts in the careful economy of her movements. She was not enormous by the standards of the creatures that would follow her lineage into the Cretaceous period, not the continent-shaking size of a Tyrannosaurus, still 50 million years in the future. But she was large. 40 feet from her broad, heavy skull to the tip of the tail, she carried level and horizontal as a counterbalance behind her. Her colouring in the growing light was a deep, dusty terracotta along her flanks, lightening to a pale cream along her underbelly, with irregular darker markings across her back and the top of her massive skull that helped to break up her outline in the dappled light of the forest margins. She stood absolutely still. This was the most important thing about her, this absolute stillness. Other predators paced, they circled, they showed their impatience in the restless movement of their bodies, but she had learned, through long years and many hunts, that stillness was the most powerful weapon she possessed. Stillness was invisibility, stillness was patience made physical, and patience in the Jurassic world was everything. Her eyes tracked the herd below without the slightest movement of her head. She had identified her chosen target hours ago, a juvenile sauropod, perhaps 3 years old, perhaps 15 feet long, separated from its family group by the slow drift of nighttime grazing. The young animal stood at the edge of the main herd, close but not quite within the protective geometry of the adults, not close enough. The margin was small, but the Allosaurus had been studying margins her entire life. She breathed slowly. The sun climbed. The herd shifted. And the great predator, patient as the ancient river below, waited for the world to arrange itself into the precise configuration that would make her move possible. There was nothing cruel in this waiting, nothing angry or hateful or even particularly urgent. She was hungry in the deep physical way that large animals are hungry. Not an emotion, but a condition, a state of being as fundamental as breathing. And she would address that condition in the way her body and her lineage had been shaped to address it, with all the focused, careful, unhurried efficiency that millions of years of evolution had given her. The morning continued its slow unfolding. A light wind came up from the east, carrying with it the smell of the river and the warm sweetness of the cicad groves beyond. The Allosaurus registered this wind automatically, adjusting her body by a few degrees to remain downwind of the herd. Such adjustments were not conscious decisions. They were as automatic, as fundamentally integrated into her being as breathing is in yours. She was a perfect thing. Not perfect in any human sense of the word, not beautiful by any standard a human eye would recognize, though there was a kind of austere, functional elegance to her proportions. She was perfect in the way all truly evolved things are perfect. Exactly and precisely shaped to do exactly and precisely what she needed to do in exactly and precisely the world she inhabited. No more, no less. The sun was a full width above the horizon now, the sky shifting from its dawn pinks and ambers into the deep luminous blue of a Jurassic morning. The mist that had been sitting on the river surface was beginning to lift, driven upward by the warmth, dissolving into a brightness that made the water below sparkle and shift. The juvenile sauropod moved. It stepped away from the herd by perhaps 30 feet, drawn by a stand of particularly lush fern growth along the riverbank, its long neck curved down, its small head disappearing into the fronds. The adults nearby did not react. They were preoccupied with their own browsing, their own slow, ruminating peace. The Allosaurus did not move immediately. She waited through 3 full, slow breaths. She confirmed the wind direction again. She assessed the distance and the terrain between her position and the juvenile. A gentle slope, dry ground, a scattering of small boulders that would require 3 or 4 careful adjustments to her stride, but nothing that would significantly slow her. She noted the position of the nearest adult sauropods. She catalogued, without conscious thought, the precise arc of approach that would keep her invisible for the greatest possible portion of her run before her presence became unavoidable. And then, on the 4th breath, she moved. Not fast at first. The initial movement was almost gentle, a slow, controlled lowering of her body into a shallower, more horizontal posture, followed by the first careful steps forward into the open space of the slope. Each foot was placed with surgical precision, chosen not for speed but for silence, for the minimization of impact, for the preservation of the last possible seconds of invisibility. The herd grazed on. The juvenile sauropod raised its head briefly, some ancient reflex causing a momentary pause in its feeding. But the Allosaurus was still too far away, still moving too carefully, still too perfectly aligned with the background of pale rock and dry scrub to register clearly on those ancient simple senses. The juvenile's head dropped back to the ferns. The Allosaurus accelerated. Not to a sprint, not yet, but to a long ground-eating trot that covered the terrain between them with startling speed. The kind of movement that resolves from far away into something enormous and fast before the mind can quite process the transition. Her heavy tail rose slightly as her legs extended, her spine undulating in a long, smooth wave with each stride. The juvenile sauropod lifted its head again. This time it saw her. The reaction was immediate and instinctive, a loud, resonant call that rang out across the morning plain, a sound of alarm as old as the relationship between predator and prey itself, unchanged in its fundamental urgency through all the vast corridors of deep time. The adult sauropods in the herd reacted instantly, bodies pivoting with that surprising speed that very large animals can sometimes produce when necessity demands it. But the Allosaurus was already moving at full speed. The morning became briefly, intensely alive. The thud of enormous footfalls, the crash and spray of the river margin, the calls of alarm rippling through the herd, and then, with a resolution that was almost quiet after the noise of the chase, it was done. The Allosaurus fed. The herd moved gradually away, continuing their ancient and unhurried grazing further down the river, their alarm fading into the vast indifference of a world too old and too large to hold on to any single event for long. The feathered things in the riverside trees called again. The mist continued its slow dissolution above the river. The Jurassic morning unfolded around the feeding predator with the same beautiful, unhurried composure with which it had begun. Because this was how things were here, in the world before us. Not cruel, not kind, simply perfectly, exactly, entirely itself. And that, in its own deep way, was the most peaceful thing in the world. There are places in the world where land and water cannot decide between them which one belongs. The delta, the marsh, the shallow, reedy borderland where the river releases itself into something larger, a lake, a sea, an estuary stretching out toward the horizon in an expanse of light-caught water and movement. These are ancient places, older in their character than almost any other landscape on Earth, and in the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, they were among the most richly inhabited environments on the planet. Imagine such a place now. Let it assemble itself slowly in your mind with all the patience of the deep time that shaped it. The water first, warm, shallow, amber-tinted with the tannins of decaying vegetation, moving in slow braided channels through an enormous flat of reeds and mud, and occasional islands of firmer ground where the trees could find enough purchase to stand. The sky above it enormous and pale, a washed-out blue that deepens only at its farthest reaches toward the horizon, where the distant tree line of the higher ground makes a dark, irregular mark against the light. The sounds of this place are layered. Water, always. The constant low murmur of shallow channels in gentle motion, the occasional deeper gurgle where the current concentrates around the base of a submerged log or a shelf of pale, soft rock. Insects. An immense, ongoing, omnidirectional chorus, higher and more complex than the soundscape of the upland forests, the product of thousands of species evolved specifically for this warm, wet, endlessly productive world. And occasionally, from deeper in the reed beds, the calls of creatures larger and stranger, a low, resonant boom that travels across the water surface with remarkable clarity, or a sharp, percussive bark that sends ripples radiating outward from its unseen source before the reeds settle back into their lazy swaying. This particular delta is very old, even by Jurassic standards. It has been building itself for millions of years, each flood season depositing a thin layer of fine sediment across its floor, slowly raising the entire flat by increments, too small to measure in a human lifetime, but enormous in geological time. The river that feeds it has changed its course several times in the last 100,000 years, abandoning old channels and cutting new ones, leaving isolated ponds and lakes as reminders of old paths. The resulting landscape is a labyrinth, not the dark, threatening labyrinth of a human nightmare, but something more like a very large, very complex garden, full of small discoveries and quiet corners, and places where the light comes through the reed stalks at a particular angle and turns everything gold. Into this labyrinth every morning with the consistency of the tides came the fish. They came from the open water to the west, following channels that had been paths for fish for as long as there had been fish to follow them. Great schools of them, primitive teleosts and larger, more archaic forms, their scales catching the morning light as they moved in those beautiful coordinated masses that seemed to operate by a single shared mind. They came to feed on the rich beds of aquatic invertebrates that covered the delta's floor, and in feeding they were fed upon in turn by everything else the delta contained. But the fisher who mattered most in this particular stretch of water, on this particular morning, had been in position since before dawn. The Spinosaurus was standing in 3 feet of water, roughly 40 meters out from the eastern reed bed, and she had not moved for nearly 2 hours. She was astonishing to look at if you had the privilege of observing her from a safe distance, which in this story you do. Her body combined elements that should not, by any obvious logic, have been capable of coexisting in one creature. The overall structure was that of a large theropod, bipedal, with powerful hind legs and reduced forelimbs, but the proportions were wrong for any simple category. Her skull was enormously elongated, more than 5 feet from the back of her broad cranium to the tip of her long, narrow, deeply toothed snout. The snout itself had the same basic engineering as a crocodile's, a design arrived at independently by evolution, because it is simply, undeniably, the most effective shape for catching fish in shallow water. Along her back, rising from a row of elongated vertebral spines, her sail caught the morning light, a broad flat expanse of skin stretched between spines that reached 6 feet above the ridge of her back at the highest point, its surface a deep, earthy red-orange with irregular darker bands that might have served for temperature regulation or display or both. She stood utterly still. The water around her legs was clear enough to see the pale sand of the delta floor, the slow movement of aquatic vegetation in the current, and, coming toward her now from the western channels, the leading edge of the morning's fish run. The Spinosaurus saw them before the water showed them clearly, some combination of the faint bow wave they pushed ahead of themselves, and perhaps a vibration through the water that her legs registered before her eyes confirmed it. Her head lowered slightly, the long snout dropping to within a foot of the water's surface, her eyes set forward and low on her skull, focused with the absolute unwavering attention of a creature for whom this exact moment represented the entire point of existence. The fish came on. They flowed around the Spinosaurus's legs like water around the piers of a bridge, parting, continuing, indifferent to the enormous shape standing among them, the way animals often fail to register true danger until the very last moment when all the distance has run out. The strike was almost too fast to follow. The long skull drove downward with the snap of a release spring, the water exploding upward and outward in a white circle, and when the Spinosaurus raised her head again, a large fish, 3 feet long, armoured with heavy scales, thrashing with the vigorous desperation of something that has just had its world change entirely, was crosswise in those conical teeth. She held it there for a moment, making a precise adjustment with the muscles of her jaw, and then tossed her head back in the practiced movement of a fisher who's been performing this exact action every morning for years, and the fish was gone. She resumed her stillness. The delta absorbed the disturbance of the catch without comment. The ripples spread and faded. The fish run continued around her, the school apparently unbothered by the loss of one of its number, or perhaps simply incapable of the kind of collective grief that would give such a loss significance. They came on, and she caught them, and the morning passed in this ancient unhurried exchange between water and hunger. There was something deeply calming about watching the Spinosaurus fish. This was not a predator who hunted with the thunderous, ground-shaking urgency of the large terrestrial hunters. Her method was contemplative, patient, almost philosophical in its stillness. She stood in the water like a very tall, very ancient heron, and there is something about a heron fishing that has always had the power to slow a person's breathing, to invite a kind of shared patience, a willingness to simply stand and wait, and trust that what needs to come will come. The delta around her continued its own quiet business. In the reed beds to the east, something large was moving, not in alarm but in the slow, purposeful way of a browser working its way along a food source. The reeds parted and swayed in a line that moved gradually southward, and occasionally the long neck of a small sauropod appeared above the reed tops, reaching for the higher fronds that the reeds themselves couldn't provide. The creature was perhaps 20 feet long, small by the standards of its kind, and it moved through the delta's edge with the careful, deliberate step of an animal that knew this terrain and trusted it. Above the water, the dragonflies were beginning their morning patrol. In the Cretaceous and Jurassic periods, dragonflies were large. Not the enormous meganeurids of the earlier Carboniferous age, but still impressive. The ones that now coursed low above the delta's surface, banking in swift, precise turns above the water, had wingspans as wide as a human hand is long. They moved in the constant, shifting, three-dimensional choreography that dragonflies have always performed above water, and the light caught their wings and made brief, brilliant sparks of iridescence that lasted only a fraction of a second before the creature banked away and was gone. The Spinosaurus paid no attention to the dragonflies. She had caught 4 fish now, and was settled into the rhythm of the morning's fishing in a way that had changed her posture subtly. The initial tension of the waiting, that extreme focused stillness of the first hour, had relaxed into something more like settled attention. Her body remained perfectly placed in the water, her eyes remained fixed on the current ahead of her, but there was a quality to her breathing now, visible in the slow expansion and contraction of her enormous ribcage, that suggested something close to ease. She was good at this. She had been doing it for 20 years, these morning vigils in the delta shallows, and the accumulated weight of 10,000 successful mornings had made the skill feel less like effort and more like simply being. She did not have to think about where to stand, or how to hold her head, or when to strike. All of that had long since moved below the level of conscious decision into the body's own deep knowledge, that wordless understanding that comes only from doing something 10,000 times until the doing and the being are the same. The morning fish run began to thin. The school that had been moving through the channels thinned to a straggle of individuals, and the Spinosaurus, reading this in the changing quality of the water ahead of her, began the slow, careful process of moving to another position. She stepped forward through the delta shallows with a deliberateness and precision that made almost no disturbance to the water around her. A remarkable achievement for a creature of 7 or 8 tons. But then she'd been walking these shallows for 20 years, and she knew exactly where the firm sand lay, and where the soft mud would pull at a foot, and how to distribute her weight across the uncertain surface of the delta floor. She moved upstream. The sun was higher now, the morning's pale blue deepening toward the brilliant, saturated blue of full Jurassic day. The shadows of the reed beds and small delta trees lay in precise, well-defined patches across the water's surface, and the Spinosaurus moved through light and shadow with equal ease, her sail above the water like a slow, strange sail moving across a still harbour. She found another channel. She stopped. She settled back into the patient, watchful stillness that was her primary mode of being. And the delta continued to flow around her, and the morning continued its long, gentle turn toward midday, and the fish continued their ancient and unhurried passage through the amber water, and everything was precisely as it should have been in this warm, wet, endlessly patient borderland where the river gave itself to something larger. There is a quality to watching something large and patient that is itself calming. We are drawn to it. The still heron on the bank, the great whale moving slow and certain through deep water, the enormous bear standing in the river, waiting for the salmon. Something in us responds to great patience with a kind of gratitude, a recognition that not everything in the world moves fast, that there are things which have learned through long experience that the best approach to most of what the world offers is simply to stand in the right place and wait and trust. The Spinosaurus had mastered this. And watching her practice her ancient art in the golden amber light of the delta morning, it was very easy, very natural, to let your own thoughts slow, to let the urgency of the day drain away into the warm water around her enormous legs, to match your breathing to the slow rise and fall of that enormous rib cage, and feel the morning settle over you like the light was settling over the delta, gradually, warmly, without hurry. The delta breathed. The Spinosaurus fished. The world was old and patient and entirely at peace with itself. The middle hours of a Jurassic afternoon had a particular weight to them. Not the oppressive weight of a summer afternoon in a humid city, not the heavy, stifling quality of heat without movement. The Jurassic afternoon was warm, certainly, particularly this close to the equator where this stretch of ancient floodplain lay, but the warmth had a different character to it. It was an enveloping warmth, a full-body warmth, the kind that seemed to come not just from above, but from all directions at once, from the sun-heated stone of the low ridgelines, from the warm sandy floor of the river plain, from the massive bodies of the enormous animals that occupied it. Because this was the hour of rest. The sauropods rested in the afternoon. It is not a thing that is often imagined about them, these vast long-necked browsers that everyone associates with perpetual slow-motion feeding, these animals that surely must have spent every available hour eating simply to sustain their enormous bodies. And it is true that they ate a great deal, these Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus and Brontosaurus and all their kin, cropping and consuming quantities of vegetation that would have stripped a small forest in a week. But they did not eat constantly. Like all large animals, they had rhythms, periods of activity and periods of rest, a biological clock shaped by the same ancient forces that govern the rhythms of every living thing. In the early morning, they fed. At midday, in the peak of the heat, they rested. In the late afternoon, they fed again. At night, the smaller ones slept, while the largest maintained a drowsy, standing half-sleep, their enormous bodies too large to safely lower to the ground with any regularity. But in the afternoon they rested. and the sight of a resting sauropod herd was one of the most extraordinary things the Jurassic world contained. The place where this particular herd had gathered was a broad, flat area of dry, sandy ground at the edge of a grove of tall Raucarian conifers, a place that received a full morning of sun before the angle shifted, and the conifer grove provided shade through the hottest hours. The ground here was pocked and textured by the impressions of previous visits, the deep oval depressions where enormous feet had pressed into softer ground in wetter seasons, the low mounds where animals had rested their vast bellies against the earth and left the shape of themselves in compressed dust. There were 11 of them today. 11 Diplodocus, long-necked, long-tailed, whip-slim compared to the more barrel-bodied Brachiosaurus, but enormous nonetheless, arranged in the unconscious, overlapping geometries of a herd at rest. Some lay fully on their sides, their long necks extending along the ground in gentle curves, their tails laid out behind them in the same easy, relaxed lines. Others remained standing, but with a lowered quality to their posture, heads drooping, eyes half closed, weight distributed in that particular way that says, in any animal in any period of Earth's history, that the body is taking a pause from the business of being alive. The sounds they made were gentle. Low rumbles that moved through the ground as much as through the air, the slow susurrus of enormous lungs breathing, the occasional soft, hollow knock of one long neck resting against another, or the gentle percussion of a tail's tip brushing across the dry ground in some slow, involuntary rhythm of rest. A family group of 3, a large female, a slightly smaller male, and a juvenile who might have been 2 or 3 years old, lay close together, the juvenile pressed against the female's flank in the universal posture of the young, seeking warmth and security from the large and trusted. The juvenile's eyes were fully closed, its breathing deep and slow, its small body rising and falling with a regularity that was itself deeply restful to observe. Above the resting herd, in the upper canopy of the Araucarians, something small and feathered was singing. The song was clear and pure and completely untroubled, a series of bright, crystalline notes repeated with small variations, the way birds have always sung in the middle of a peaceful day, as if the simple act of existing and breathing and being warm and alive were enough to generate this overflow of sound. Something about this scene, the great animals at rest, the warm afternoon, the singing from the trees, the deep blue of the Jurassic sky visible in patches through the canopy above, had a quality of absolute rightness about it, a quality of things being exactly as they should be, of a world that had found, through long trial and long experience, the precise arrangement that allowed every part of it to exist and persist and find its necessary rest. Farther along the floodplain, visible from the edge of the resting herd's position, a small group of Stegosaurus were also resting. The Stegosaurus were strange-looking animals by any standard, the double row of large diamond-shaped plates running in alternating pairs along their spine, the 4 heavy spikes at the end of their substantial tail, the small low-slung head on a neck that seemed almost comically short for a body that measured 25 feet from nose to tail. But they rested with a kind of solid, unhurried dignity that was entirely their own. 2 of them lay side by side, their plated backs like the ruins of some ancient elaborate architecture. A third stood nearby, motionless, its tail slightly raised, not in threat but in the simple, unconscious way that a resting animal will sometimes pause in some intermediate state, neither fully at rest nor fully alert. The afternoon heat pressed down on all of them with an equal impartial warmth. Nothing was particularly moving on this stretch of the plain. The river, visible as a glinting line half a mile to the east, moved on in its own slow time. The conifer grove behind the resting sauropods stirred occasionally in a breath of warm air, sending a brief, resinous scent across the open ground. A large dragonfly appeared from the reed bed along the riverbank, made a slow, purposeful circuit of the herd's resting place at a height of perhaps 10 feet, and then departed again with the same purposeful, unhurried air. This was what the Jurassic afternoon was at its heart. Not the dramatic, thunderous, teeth-and-blood narrative that popular imagination has sometimes constructed from the fossil record. Not a world of constant, frantic violence. But this, great animals in their proper places, resting in the warmth, breathing in the slow time of the afternoon, existing with the deep, settled confidence of creatures who had been here for millions of years, and expected, without any conscious expectation, to be here for millions more. The juvenile diplodocus stirred briefly in its sleep. Its small legs made a brief involuntary running motion, the way sleeping dogs will sometimes do, chasing something in their dreams or being chased. It is impossible to say which. Then it settled again, pressing more firmly against the warm flank of its mother, and the running stopped, and the breathing deepened again, and the afternoon continued its unhurried transit across the sky above. The female diplodocus raised her head slowly. Not in alarm, the movement was too gradual, too lacking in urgency, to be anything other than the simple, drowsy lifting of a head that has been resting for a while. She looked out across the plain with the broad, patient gaze of a very large, very comfortable animal who has decided she would like to see what the afternoon looks like. Her eyes moved slowly across the landscape, the distant river, the near tree line, the other resting members of her herd, and found nothing to concern her in any of it. She lowered her head again, placed it back down in the warm dust, closed her eyes. The juvenile pressed closer. The conifer grove rustled. The feathered thing in the canopy above sang its clear, bright song. And the afternoon lay across the Jurassic world like something given freely without condition, a gift of warmth and stillness, and the deep pleasure of simply being at rest in a world that had room for you, that had made a place for you in its ancient and continuing story, and that asked nothing of you in the long, warm, golden hours between the morning's feeding and the evening's end. This is the feeling to hold now as you rest. The warmth, the stillness, the deep, certain sense of being in your proper place in the world, with nothing required of you but the simple act of being here, breathing, resting. The sauropods breathe. The afternoon turns. Let it turn. Not all the hunters of the Jurassic world were large. This is worth dwelling on because when we think of Jurassic predators, we tend to think in the scale that the fossil record most easily preserves, the massive bones, the enormous teeth, the evidence of great size that survives the long compression of geological time. But the Jurassic world was full of hunters at every scale, from the giant Allosaurus prowling the floodplains in the afternoon light to creatures so small that their entire skeleton could fit inside a closed human hand. And many of the smallest hunters were the most active at night. The mammal was called Juramaia in the scientific naming that would come, 150 million years later, when her fossilized bones would be found in ancient lakebed sediments in what would one day be China. But she knew nothing of that. She knew only the night and the warm darkness of the burrow she'd left an hour ago, and the rich, complex world of smells that the Jurassic night laid out before her in vivid three-dimensional detail. She was the size of a small mouse. Her body was covered in dense, dark fur that absorbed the limited moonlight rather than reflecting it, making her nearly invisible against the dark forest floor as she moved. Her movements were rapid and economical, the quick, precise movements of an animal who knows that the world she moves through contains a great many things that would very much like to eat her, and who has learned that speed and silence and the ability to vanish instantly into a gap between roots or beneath a fallen log are the primary requirements for staying alive. She stopped, pressed herself flat against the base of a large cycad trunk. Above her, something large had moved through the lower canopy, a small pterosaur perhaps, or one of the feathered theropods that hunted by night in the margins of the forests. Whatever it was, it had moved on without noticing her, and after a moment she relaxed from her flattened stillness and resumed her careful, quick progress through the undergrowth. The forest floor at night was a different world from the forest floor by day. The smells were different, richer, more complex, the warmth of the day having released a long procession of organic compounds from the leaf litter and the fungi and the decaying wood that lay everywhere on the forest floor, each one a signal in the language of the night. The sounds were different too. The insect chorus had shifted in composition and character, from the day's bright churring to something lower, more resonant, a deeper frequency that seemed to fill the spaces between the trees rather than simply occupy them. And the light was different, of course. The moon was nearly full tonight, and its light filtered through the canopy in shafts and patches, turning certain sections of the forest floor silver, while leaving the spaces between in absolute black. The mammal moved through these alternating zones with practiced ease, spending as little time as possible in the light and as much as possible in the dark, reading the forest floor ahead of her for the signatures of food, the chemical traces of insects, the tiny vibrations in the leaf litter that said something small and alive was moving there. She found a beetle. The beetle was navigating between two fallen cycad fronds on the business of its own night, entirely unaware of the small warm shape that was watching it from 6 inches away, with eyes that, while not particularly sharp by the standards of the predators above, were more than adequate for detecting movement in the patchy moonlight. The mammal's body coiled slightly in the way of very small predators preparing to strike, and then she moved, a quick, decisive dart that ended with the beetle firmly between her small, precise teeth. She ate it quickly. There was no ceremony to it, no savouring. Efficiency was everything for a creature of her size and vulnerability. She consumed the beetle in a few swift bites, turned her nose immediately back to the leaf litter in search of the next, and continued her methodical harvest of the forest floor. This was her world. This small, careful, nocturnal world, bounded by the reach of a few dozen meters in any direction from her burrow, rich beyond imagining in the language of smell and sound and texture, filled with 1,000 small dangers and 1,000 small pleasures that the enormous creatures resting in the open spaces beyond the forest edge would never know. She was aware of the large things, not by any complex cognitive process. She did not think about them, did not contemplate the relationship between her size and theirs, with anything like the reflective capacity that would eventually develop in her descendants. But she knew them in the deep bodily way that small prey animals know predators, as a constant background pressure in her awareness, a pull on her attention, a reason for the particular quality of alertness that never entirely left her, even in the relative safety of the burrow. Tonight the large things were far away. She could smell them at the edges of her range, the warm, heavy scent of the resting sauropods carried on the night air from the open plain, and something else, further off, that she processed without name as a danger to be avoided. The Allosaurus was out tonight, moving along the edge of the forest in the darkness. The mammal registered this the way you might register the sound of distant thunder while sitting warm inside, as information to be noted, filed, and factored into the choices of the next few hours without disrupting the immediate business of finding beetles. The night moved on. The moon tracked its arc across the star-crowded Jurassic sky. In the forest, in the open plain, in the reed beds along the river, the night's countless small dramas played themselves out in the darkness. Predators finding prey, prey evading predators, all the ancient negotiations of survival conducted in the dark with the same methodical persistence that they had been conducted for 400 million years and would be conducted for 400 million more. The small mammal found 3 more beetles, a large millipede and 2 moths resting on the underside of a fallen log. She returned to her burrow before the first light. She curled herself into a small warm ball in the darkness at the burrow's deepest point, her tiny heart slowing from the quick, busy rhythm of the night's hunting to the slower, deeper beat of sleep, and she closed her eyes, and the darkness behind them was warm and safe and complete. And above her the Jurassic night continued its ancient business, vast and patient and entirely indifferent to the small sleeping mammal in her burrow beneath the cycad roots, this tiny, warm-blooded, furry, persistent little creature who was, in the long mathematics of evolution, the most important animal in the forest. The ancestor. Yours. There is something uniquely calming about a storm experienced from a place of shelter. This is an ancient feeling, older than houses, older than cities, older than human beings themselves. The feeling of being dry and warm while rain falls and thunder moves through the air outside. This is one of the most fundamental pleasures that any creature with the capacity to feel pleasure can experience. It is, in its own quiet way, a celebration of shelter, of warmth, of the simple, enormous privilege of being inside while the outside does what the outside does. In the Jurassic world, storms were significant events. Not more violent necessarily than the storms of our own era. The physics of weather are ancient, largely unchanged through the hundreds of millions of years since weather first existed. But in the context of an open landscape with few tall structures and an enormous sky, they had a scale, a totality, that it is difficult to fully imagine. There was nowhere to look that was not part of the storm. The sky occupied every direction. The horizon was an unbroken line between Earth and whatever was happening in the air above it. This particular storm had been building since mid-afternoon. It had begun as a thickening of the western sky, a gradual change in the quality of the light, the bright direct sun of midday softening into something more diffuse as the first high clouds moved in. By early afternoon, the thickening had deepened into a full overcast, the sky a uniform, pressing grey that turned the normally vivid greens of the forest a more muted, more intimate shade. The temperature had dropped several degrees in an hour. The insects had gone quiet. The animals knew. The Stegosaurus on the plain had moved hours ago, drifting in their slow, unhurried way toward the denser forest, where the large conifers provided some shelter from the rain. The Sauropod herd had moved similarly, not in the panicked rush of animals responding to immediate threat, but in the gradual, considered way of animals responding to changing conditions. A slight change of direction here, a quickening of pace there, a general drift toward the higher ground where the drainage would be better and the footing would remain firmer once the rain began. Even the small mammal in her burrow had spent the afternoon adding material to the walls and ceiling of her nest, an unconscious, instinctive response to the atmospheric pressure that had been dropping all day. The first thunder came at dusk. It was distant, a low extended rumble from well to the west, felt more than heard, a vibration that moved through the ground and up through the feet before the ear registered it. The birds in the forest edge tree line fell silent at it, waiting through the long reverberation in a collective stillness that had something almost reverent about it. Then the lightning. Far away at first, a silent branched flicker at the horizon that illuminated the underside of the storm clouds for half a second and then was gone. Then closer, with a sharper quality to the light, and a shorter interval before the thunder that followed. Then closer still, and the intervals shortened further, and the thunder arrived not as a distant rumble but as a sharp, resonant crack that split the air directly above and then rolled away in a long, reverberant diminuendo across the plain. And then the rain. It came with a directness that was almost decisive, not a gradual increase from a few drops to a drizzle to something more serious, but a sudden, definitive arrival, as if someone had simply opened a door. The drops were large and warm, and they hit the broad cycad fronds and the flat surfaces of the araucarian bark and the sandy surface of the dry ground with a continuous, complex percussion that rose within seconds to a roar. In a shallow cave in the limestone face of a low ridge overlooking the floodplain, 3 Allosaurus were sheltering. The word sounds strange, perhaps. Allosaurus seeking shelter, the apex predator of its world retreating from something as simple as rain. But large theropods did shelter from serious weather, particularly the very large females who, like this particular Allosaurus and her 2 subadult offspring from the previous year's brood, had sufficient cognitive capacity to identify shelter and sufficient motivation to use it. The cave was not deep, perhaps 15 feet back from the entrance, narrowing to an impassable crack. But 15 feet was more than enough to be out of the direct rain, and the limestone overhang above the entrance caught and deflected the heaviest of the downpour, keeping the cave floor dry even as the rain hammered the rock outside with increasing intensity. The 2 subadults, young animals, each roughly 20 feet long, not yet the full size of their mother but already carrying the primary architecture of the adult Allosaurus, were settled toward the back of the cave. One lay fully on its side, long tail curved around the base of the cave wall, its eyes half open and reflecting the occasional lightning flash from the cave mouth. The other sat in a more upright position, its head resting on a fold of its own neck, watching the rain with the dreamy, unfocused attention of an animal that has eaten recently and is operating at a low energy level. The mother stood at the cave mouth. She was not alarmed by the storm. She had lived through many storms in her 23 years, but there was a quality to her attention as she stood watching the rain that went beyond simple shelter-seeking. Something in the quality of a large, intelligent animal watching something larger than itself, not with fear, not with calculation, but with a kind of recognition, an acknowledging of scale, of something beyond her. Lightning split the sky above the plain. In its brilliant, instantaneous light, the entire landscape was momentarily revealed, the flat expanse of the plain stretching to the river, the dark smudge of the conifer forest beyond, the river itself catching the light and reflecting it back in a broad, shivering flash. The rain fell in silver curtains across all of it. The distant sauropods were barely visible, pale shapes at the forest edge, enormous and motionless and patient. Then the thunder. The mother Allosaurus did not flinch at the thunder, but one of the subadults behind her lifted its head suddenly, the eyes opening fully for a moment before the reverberation died away, and the young animal settled back into its half-sleep. The rain intensified. Rivers began to appear across the plain's surface, not permanent watercourses, but the temporary fast-moving sheets of water that a heavy rain generates across flat, dry ground, channeling down every slight depression and running together into wider, faster flows that move toward the river with purposeful urgency. The surface of the plain glittered with these moving sheets of water, and the air above it was so full of spray that the further distances were obscured in a pale, luminous haze. It was beautiful. This is a thing worth saying about the Jurassic world in the rain. It was profoundly, surprisingly beautiful. The colours deepened with the moisture. The greens became extraordinary, brilliant, alive in a way they never quite achieved in dry conditions. The grey of the limestone ridges and the pale sand of the riverbeds turned to silver. The air smelled of ozone and warm earth, and the sharp, clean scent of water on dry stone, a smell as old as weather itself, unchanged from its first occurrence hundreds of millions of years ago, still carrying the same message of renewal, of freshness, of the world being washed clean and ready to begin again. Inside the cave, the young Allosaurus slept. The mother watched the rain. The storm moved steadily eastward, as storms in this region generally did, following the prevailing patterns of the ancient atmospheric circulation. After an hour, the intensity began to ease, the roar of the rain softening by degrees into a steady, persistent fall, then into something lighter, more variable, interrupted by occasional stronger bursts but generally diminishing. The lightning was farther away now, the thunder longer after it, the intervals between growing. The plain below the cave gleamed with standing water. The mother Allosaurus stepped outside into the rain's diminishing edge. She stood in the cave mouth for a moment, testing the cool, wet air with the sensory apparatus that evolution had given her, the chemical receptors in her nasal passages, the vibration-sensing structures in her lower jaw and feet, the deep, mobile eyes that could adjust to almost any light level. The world was clean and quiet and rain-washed. She was hungry again, in that vast, physical, non-emotional way of large predators after a storm. She stepped out into the rain. Behind her, the two young Allosaurus continued their sleep. And the storm continued its eastward passage, and the plain continued its slow drainage back toward the river, and the Jurassic night, rain-washed and cool and smelling of the deep, clean earth, settled back into the profound quiet that was its natural condition. Rest now. Let the rain fall, if it will, outside wherever you are. Let the world do its cleaning, its renewing, its ancient and unhurried work. You are inside. You are warm. Some forests hold their secrets close. The Jurassic forests of the lowland belt, the dense, multi-layered jungle that grew in the richest soils of the floodplains, where water was plentiful and the sun filtered down through multiple canopy layers in warm, green-filtered shafts, were among the most complex environments that had ever existed on the surface of the Earth. They were not simply collections of large plants. They were ecosystems of extraordinary intricacy, each organism connected to dozens of others in webs of dependency and competition, and mutual benefit that operated simultaneously at every scale from the microscopic to the enormous. In the canopy, 60 and 70 feet above the forest floor, the largest araucarians and tree ferns spread their crowns in a continuous overlapping mat of green that intercepted the majority of the available sunlight and converted it, through the ancient chemistry of photosynthesis, into the structural material of life. Below this upper canopy, a second layer of smaller trees and large ferns created a middle story that received the filtered light that made it through the canopy above and used it for its own purposes, and at the forest floor, in the deep, warm, perpetual twilight created by all this stacked vegetation above, the ground layer, mosses and small ferns and fungi and the sprawling root systems of the trees above, occupied the last available niche. This was the world of the Colophysis, or rather the world of their descendants. The Colophysis themselves had lived in the earlier Triassic, but the small, lithe, quick-moving theropods that filled the same ecological niche in the Jurassic forests were their evolutionary successors, slender, fast, intelligent for their time, hunting in loose groups through the forest understory in pursuit of small prey that the larger predators of the open plain would have found beneath their notice. There were 7 of them today. They moved through the forest floor in the coordinated, semi-coherent way of social hunters. Not quite a pack, not quite a school, but something in between, a loose grouping of individuals whose movements influenced and tracked each other through a combination of visual and vocal cues that kept them generally oriented in the same direction, without requiring the close physical coordination of the larger, more elaborately social predators. The largest was perhaps 6 feet long, including the long, whip-thin tail she used as a counterbalance as she moved at speed through the undergrowth. Her colouring was a mixture of rust and dark brown that made her almost invisible against the forest floor's palette of leaf litter and shadow. She moved with the quick, precise energy of a creature who burned fuel fast and needed to replenish it frequently, the rapid, purposeful movement of a warm-blooded hunter in a world of cold-blooded prey. She paused. Her head lowered, her gaze fixing on something in the leaf litter a few meters ahead, a small lizard, perhaps 8 inches long, that had been moving with what it presumably hoped was adequate stealth along the base of a large cicad trunk. The lizard froze. The small theropod angled toward it with a quality of movement that was both controlled and irresistibly purposeful, the movement of something that has learned, through long experience, exactly how to close the last few feet of distance between itself and prey without triggering the prey's final last-moment flee response. The lizard fled. Not quite last moment, a fraction of a second too early, launched sideways and upward across the cicad trunk with the explosive, desperate speed of something that has been near death and chosen life. The small theropod reacted instantly, her whole body pivoting in a turn that happened faster than the eye could track. But the lizard had already vanished into a crack in the cicad's base, and after a moment of investigation that confirmed the crack was too narrow to access, the hunter straightened and moved on. This was the reality of hunting for small predators. The large predators, the Allosaurus, the Spinosaurus, the great ambush hunters of the open landscape, had a relatively high success rate on any individual hunt because their prey was large, slow, and limited in its escape options. The small predators had a different equation. Their prey was quick, cryptic, and extremely good at exploiting the forest's countless hiding places. A successful hunt required many attempts, and failure was the norm rather than the exception. But the small predators had compensations. Their prey was also by its nature ubiquitous. The forest floor was alive with small, warm-bodied things, lizards and early mammals, large insects and small frogs, the occasional hatching of a ground-nesting bird. The forest provided its hunters with a continuous, distributed supply of small rewards rather than the feast and famine rhythm of the large predators. A Colophysis analogue could eat 20 times in a day, each meal small, the total nonetheless adequate to sustain a body running at the high metabolic rate that her warm-blooded physiology demanded. The group moved on through the forest. Their passage was quiet, not the absolute disciplined silence of a large predator stalking, but a kind of functional quiet, the busy, purposeful sounds of active small hunters minimized to what was unavoidable. The occasional soft snap of a leaf underfoot, the brief low vocalization that one individual directed toward another to maintain the group's spatial coherence, the flutter of wings high above as some feathered creature in the middle canopy registered their presence and decided to move further up. The forest deepened around them. The trees here were older, the largest trunks 5 and 6 feet in diameter at their bases, their root systems spreading across the forest floor in great buttressed arcs that created a series of natural chambers and passages between them. The light was at its dimmest here, filtered through so many layers of vegetation that it had a greenish aquatic quality, like light underwater. The air was cool and still, and full of the rich, dark smell of deep forest. Earth and decay and fungi and the slow, patient work of decomposition that kept the forest chemistry cycling. In the chambers between the root buttresses, other things sheltered. A small mammal, different species from the one we met at the forest edge, slightly larger, her fur a deeper brown, sat in the hollow between two massive roots and watched the passage of the hunters through the shadows with the frozen, focused attention of something that knows it is on the wrong end of the predator-prey relationship. She was exactly the right size to be of interest to the small theropods. She knew this. She waited, unbreathing, until the hunters had passed, and then she waited several minutes more before resuming the careful grooming of her fur that she had been interrupted in. The small theropods found a frog near a seep of groundwater that emerged between two root buttresses. The frog was large by the standards of the Jurassic amphibians, a flat, wide-bodied creature, well camouflaged against the mud of the seep's margin, absolutely still in the way that frogs have always achieved stillness, which is to say absolutely, perfectly, not there at all. The smallest of the hunters found it first. The strike was quick and definitive. The remaining hunters continued on through the forest, their attention moving immediately to the next possibility, the forest's next gift. The afternoon progressed in this way, the small hunters moving through their intricate, complex world, harvesting its bounty in small, frequent increments, their energy and attention perpetually focused on the immediate, the specific, the present. There was no anxiety in them, no planning beyond the next few seconds, no weight of past or future, only the forest and the movement through it, and the bright, focused attention of the hunt. There is something worth learning from this, perhaps. This quality of presence, of bringing the full attention of the body and mind to the immediate, the here, the now. Not as a theory or a practice, but as a way of being, the natural mode of any creature fully adapted to its environment and fully engaged with the business of living in it. The forest continued its ancient and patient life around the hunters. The afternoon light filtered down in its green aqueous shafts. And if you let your mind follow those hunters through the deep, cool, quiet places between the roots and the ferns, let your attention narrow to the immediate, the sensory, the present, you might find that the day's accumulated thoughts and worries have grown somewhat distant, somewhat vague, somewhat less urgent than they seemed an hour ago. The forest does that. The deep, old, quiet forest. It has been doing it for a very long time. Beyond the land, the sea. It has always been there, the great, encircling, ancient ocean that covers the majority of the Earth's surface in any geological period you care to choose. In the Jurassic era, the configuration of the continents was different from anything a modern map would show. The great supercontinent of Pangaea had begun its long, slow breaking apart, and the ocean was different in its specific shapes and channels, but the ocean itself was the same ancient body of water it has always been, vast, deep, full of its own ancient lives. The Jurassic seas were warm, warmer than the modern ocean at comparable latitudes, warmed by a climate that was globally several degrees hotter than our own, by an atmosphere richer in carbon dioxide, by the particular configuration of ocean currents, in a world with fewer and differently shaped land masses, the shallow waters of the Jurassic Sea, the warm, light-filled regions above the continental shelves, teemed with life in quantities that are difficult to conceive today. Ammonites moved through the water column in their millions. They were extraordinary creatures, these Jurassic ammonites, coiled in their elegant logarithmic spirals, ranging from the size of a coin to the size of a cartwheel, their shells ornamented with intricate ribbing and suturing that made each one a small work of geometric art. They moved by jet propulsion, drawing water into their mantles and expelling it through a flexible siphon, and the combined effect of millions of them moving through the lit water of the shallow sea was a kind of visual music, a complex, shifting, beautiful pattern of movement that had no single direction or purpose, but cohered somehow into something larger than any individual. Among them hunting the ichthyosaurs. These were not dinosaurs, an important distinction, though one that barely registers in the deep time where we are operating. They were marine reptiles, descended from land-living ancestors who had returned to the sea in the Triassic, and had, over 50 million years of aquatic evolution, arrived at a body form so perfectly adapted for the ocean that a modern eye might initially mistake them for large, streamlined fish or small cetaceans. A school of Ophthalmosaurus moved through the lit water in the mid-afternoon sunlight. Their name means eye lizard, and it is an appropriate name because the most striking thing about them, the thing that immediately arrests the attention, is the size of their eyes. In an animal 10 feet long, the eye might be 9 inches in diameter. These were among the largest eyes, relative to body size, of any vertebrate in the history of the Earth. Eyes designed to gather light in the deep, dim ocean layers where the school spent part of each day hunting squid and fish in near darkness. But here, in the sunlit shallows, those enormous eyes gave them a gentle, almost dreamy quality. The expression of animals perpetually wide-eyed, with what might have been wonder, or might simply have been the unchanging fact of their anatomy, which amounts to the same thing in the end. The school moved with a fluid coordination that was itself beautiful to observe. 12 animals, each roughly the same size, moving in a loose bowl-shaped formation through the water, their movements synchronized not by any obvious signal, but by the continuous, unconscious reading of each other's position and velocity that schooling animals perform. When the lead individuals turned, the turn propagated through the school in a wave that reached the trailing edge a fraction of a second after it began, and the effect was of a single, very large animal expressing a change of mind. They were hunting. The ammonites scattered before them, or rather the ammonites attempted their jet propulsion evasion in every direction simultaneously, the school of ichthyosaurs passing through the ammonite cloud like wind through leaves, each animal making quick, precise lunges at individuals that had separated themselves by a fraction from the general movement. The catches were brief and definitive. The hunting was not the extended, dramatic chase of the land predators, but something faster and more surgical, the quick, expert harvest of experienced fishers working a known ground. Deeper in the water column, beyond the reach of the afternoon's light, other things moved. The Plesiosauria were long-necked ocean hunters, not ichthyosaurs, but a related group, more slow-moving, less streamlined, their 4 large flippers paddling them through the water, with a rowing motion that gave them a curiously deliberate quality compared to the faster fish-like efficiency of the ichthyosaurs. They were patient hunters, moving through the water column in the long, unhurried way of animals who cover large distances in search of concentrated prey, rather than sprinting after individual targets. The Jurassic Sea moved around them in the slow, vast rhythms of the deep water, the long, gentle swells generated by distant winds, the deeper, slower oscillations of water masses responding to the rotation of the Earth, the perpetual, gentle drift of surface water driven by the trade winds that had been blowing across this ocean since before there were any eyes to observe them. Far below, in the cold and absolute darkness of the deep ocean floor, nothing much moved. This is the oldest silence in the world. The deep ocean, in any geological period, is one of the quietest places that exists. Not silent, the ocean produces sound, deep, low-frequency sounds that carry for thousands of miles through its layers, but quiet in the way that matters, quiet in the way that is felt rather than measured. The weight of all that water above, the absolute darkness, the cold, the slow, barely perceptible movement of bottom currents that carry the finest sediment particles from one end of the deep ocean to another over the course of centuries. Down here, what little life existed was sparse and strange. Deep-sea invertebrates, adapted to the cold and the dark and the crushing pressure, living their long, slow lives in near total isolation from the bright, busy world above. But we do not need to go so deep. We can remain in the sunlit shallows, in the warm water where the ichthyosaurs are finishing their afternoon hunt, and beginning the long, leisurely transit back toward the deeper water, where they will spend the night. The ammonites have dispersed, and the water is calmer now, and the afternoon light is moving toward the lower, warmer frequencies of the early evening as the sun descends toward the horizon. The school of Ophthalmosaurus moves into deeper water. Their enormous eyes adjust continuously and without apparent effort to the changing light as they descend, widening, the pupils expanding to gather the increasing quantities of light that the depth demands. They move in the same fluid, coordinated formation they have maintained all afternoon, unhurried, their passage through the water generating barely any disturbance, only the faint pressure waves that spread outward from their bodies and fade into the general motion of the sea. Below them the seafloor recedes. Above them, the surface brightens as the sun touches the horizon and spreads its light in long, flat rays across the water, turning the upper layers to gold and copper and a deep, burnished amber that penetrates several meters down before fading to green and then to the slow blue of depth. The school slows. They drift for a time, barely moving, their flippers making only the occasional gentle adjustment, the way large, comfortable marine animals often do in the late afternoon, entering a state of reduced activity that is not quite sleep, but has some of the same quality of rest, of the body operating at a lower register, the urgency of the day's hunting complete and the night's different rhythms not yet begun. One of the ichthyosaurs drifts slightly apart from the school, rising toward the surface in a long, gentle spiral, and breaks the water with her blunt, dolphin-like nose to breathe. The sound of her exhalation is soft and brief, a small, warm sound against the vast quiet of the Jurassic Sea, and then she slides back below the surface and rejoins the school. The sea holds them. The evening holds them. And the world, enormous and ancient and absolutely at ease with itself, continues its slow turning. Evening comes to the Jurassic floodplain in long, warm degrees. It does not arrive with any abruptness. It announces itself first in the quality of the light, the direct overhead white of midday becoming something more angular, more golden, as the sun moves toward the horizon and its light travels a longer path through the atmosphere. Shadows lengthen. The tree line at the western edge of the plain becomes a sharp, dark silhouette against a sky that is beginning to accumulate the particular richness of evening. Deep blues and warm golds layered over each other in gradations too subtle and continuous to count. The animals of the open plain respond to this shift in the light. The sauropods, who had rested through the midday heat, are moving again, resuming their browsing with the calm, purposeful appetite of creatures who know there are still several hours of feeding time before the true darkness falls. The stegosaurus at the edge of the conifer grove have emerged from the shadow of the trees and are moving in a slow, deliberate group along the river margin, pausing every few paces to crop the lush vegetation that grows along the water's edge. And on the far side of the plain, moving at the pace of something that has all the time in the world, a single ankylosaur is making its unhurried way toward the grove of cycads, where it has spent the last several nights. She is a large individual, 20 feet from her armoured head to the heavy bony club at the tip of her tail, her back a fortress of interlocking osteoderms and horn-covered scutes, the most comprehensively armoured creature on the plain. The plates cover her entirely from above. No weak spots, no gaps, just an unbroken expanse of bone and horn that turns every surface of her body into something closer to a rock than to flesh. Her underbelly is softer, as underbellies always are, but an ankylosaur rarely needs to expose her underbelly. Her defense is the passive, impregnable defense of something that simply does not need to worry about what the world intends to do to it. She walks slowly. This is perhaps the most defining thing about her, not her armour, not the extraordinary tail club that she can swing with enough force to shatter the ankle bones of any predator foolish enough to approach from behind, but simply the rate at which she moves through the world. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. She is not a creature built for speed, and she has never needed to be. Her defense is her armour. Her response to danger is to stand still and lower her body close to the ground, pressing the soft underbelly to the earth, and presenting to any attacker only the impenetrable upper surface. Speed has never been part of her strategy. This means she moves through the world with a particular quality. A particular attentiveness, perhaps. The attentiveness of a creature who, because it cannot run away from the world, has learned to simply be in the world. She notices things. The particular quality of the grass beneath her feet, whether it is soft or dry, yielding or resistant. The changing smells of the late afternoon, the cooling dust, the warm vegetation, the distant river. The sounds of the plain around her, the sauropods and the stegosaurus and the insects and the evening birds, all of it absorbed and processed through whatever awareness she possesses in her small but capable brain. She stops beside a stand of locucads. She lowers her head and begins to eat with the steady, powerful efficiency of a very large herbivore. Her beak crops the fronds at their base, and she chews them with the dedicated patience of an animal who has no other agenda, who is not worried about anything that might approach. There is nothing on this plain that can easily harm her after all, and her body knows this in the same deep, wordless way that a great whale knows the safety of the open ocean. She eats for a long time, The evening light deepens around her. The shadows of the cycads extend eastward across the warm ground, and the sky above takes on the deep amber of the hour before sunset, and the air cools by another degree, and somewhere in the direction of the river a bird calls once and then is quiet. When she has eaten enough, she moves on. The cycad grove is perhaps another quarter-mile ahead. She can smell it, the particular resinous, spicy smell of cycad bark and the softer green smell of the shade beneath. She has been spending her nights there for several weeks now, drawn by the shelter the grove provides and the abundance of food within easy reach. Each evening she makes this same walk across the plain. Each morning she makes the reverse journey, and the routine of it has worn a faint path in the dry grass, a gentle curve of compressed stems that represents nothing more dramatic than the daily transit of a single large animal between feeding and sleeping. A young Allosaurus appears at the edge of the forest. It is a juvenile, perhaps 5 years old, perhaps 12 feet long, still learning the world. It watches the ankylosaur from a distance with the interested, somewhat baffled expression of a predator who has been told by instinct that something this large should be prey, but who has also learned, through at least one painful lesson, that the heavily armoured animal with the bone club on its tail is not prey in any practical sense of the word. The ankylosaur registers the young Allosaurus without alarm. Her tail swings slightly, just slightly, a minimal expression of awareness, not the full defensive preparation of an animal under genuine threat. It is more like a gesture, a communication, an acknowledgement that says, with perfect economy and complete confidence, I see you. I am not concerned, and you should not be either, as long as you remain at that comfortable distance. The young Allosaurus watches for a moment longer. Then it turns and disappears back into the forest edge. The ankylosaur continues her walk. The cycad grove is close now, its smell richer and more distinct with every step. The evening light is at its warmest, the sun fully orange now above the horizon, the plain ahead of her painted in shades of gold and copper that make everything look somehow more significant, more carefully placed than it ordinarily does in the flat bright light of midday. She enters the grove. The shade is immediate and wonderful, not the sharp cold shade of deep forest, but the soft dappled shade of late evening in a grove, where the light still comes through in long warm rays between the trunks and illuminates floating dust and the slow drift of insects in patterns of impossible intricacy. She finds her place. There is a specific location between 3 cycad trunks that form a rough triangle of space just large enough for her body, the ground here packed and smooth from previous nights. She lowers herself into this space with the slow, deliberate care of a very heavily armoured animal negotiating a comfortable position, her feet settling, her belly lowering to the warm ground, her armoured back rising above her like a small, elaborately decorated hill. She is still. The grove is quiet around her. Above her, in the cycad crowns, the last insects of the day are making their evening sounds, a complex, layered murmur that rises and falls in no particular pattern, governed only by the accumulated choices of thousands of small creatures operating on their own small immediate rhythms. The evening star appears. First one, then 2, then a widening scatter of stars appearing through the gaps in the cycad canopy, as the sky above darkens by degrees from amber, through deep blue toward the first shade of true night. The ankylosaur breathes slowly. Her eyes close. She is entirely at ease in the world. She is safe, she is eaten, she's warm, she's in her place, and the night, which will bring whatever it brings, will find her entirely prepared to receive it, not through alertness, or strategy, or planning, but through the simple, absolute security of an animal whose body is itself its protection, whose defense is woven into its very skin, whose peace comes not from the absence of threat, but from the certainty that no threat in this world can truly reach her. This is a profound kind of peace. The kind that doesn't require the world to be safe, only the self to be protected. And as the grove darkens and the stars multiply and the ankylosaur's breathing settles into the slow rhythm of sleep, the Jurassic night arranges itself around her with the gentle patience of the world accommodating one of its creatures at rest. There is a particular hour at the very end of the day that belongs to no one. The sun has set, but the sky is not yet dark. that brief, luminous interval when the horizon holds a last wide arc of warm colour, and the sky above it grades from deep orange through purple to the first true blue of night, and everything below is held in a diffuse directionless light that comes from nowhere in particular and illuminates everything equally, without shadows, without hierarchy. The geologists who study deep time sometimes speak of something they call deep time vertigo, the unsettling sensation that comes when you fully understand, not just intellectually but in your body, in your gut, how old the Earth actually is. 150 million years. Not a number, not an abstraction, but an actual span of time, filled with actual moments, actual days ending in actual twilights watched by actual eyes that are gone now, but that were, in their moment, as real and present and alive as yours are now. Every sunset of the Jurassic was watched by something. This is the thought to hold in this last gentle hour. Every sunset for 150 million years, every single one of the 65 trillion or so sunsets that occurred between the first Jurassic day and the last, was watched by something alive. There was never a sunset that fell on an empty Earth, never a twilight that lit only rock and water with no eye to receive it. Life was always present. Something was always there to experience the end of the day, whether it was a sauropod lifting its long neck from its evening browsing to turn, from some deep bodily intuition, toward the warm light on the horizon, or an ankylosaur settling into her nighttime place with the slow, satisfied exhale of a creature whose day has been complete, or a tiny mammal at the mouth of her burrow, nose lifted to the cooling air, reading the chemistry of the Jurassic evening with senses as perfectly tuned to that task as any instrument you could imagine. The last light fell on all of them equally. It does not fall on them now. The world they inhabited is gone, not gone as in destroyed, but gone as in transformed. The same matter that built their bodies and their world now rearranged into this different world, our world, still carrying within it the long history of everything that has ever lived here. We are made, in some small but real sense, of Jurassic material. The carbon in your body has been through things you will never quite be able to imagine. The calcium in your bones has been in the bones of creatures whose names we are only beginning to learn. You are continuous with the deep past. This is not a frightening thought. It is, when you sit with it long enough, a profoundly comforting one. The long, long story of life on this planet has been running for 4 billion years without a break, without a pause, without a single generation in which life did not find a way to continue into the next moment. You are the most recent chapter of a story that has never been interrupted. That story, whatever else it is one of extraordinary persistence, extraordinary creativity, extraordinary patience. The Jurassic world did not know it was ending. It would not end quickly in any case. The Jurassic gave way to the Cretaceous over millions of years, and the great reptilian world of the dinosaurs would continue for another 80 million years after the period we have been visiting tonight. These animals would evolve, diversify, explore new body forms and new ecological roles, spread to every continent and every environment the Earth offered. There was no ending in sight on any evening we have witnessed tonight. Only continuation. Only the world going on in the steady, patient way it always has, and to whatever extent we can trust the evidence of 4 billion years of experience, always will. The twilight deepens. Across the floodplain, the last sauropods are settling into their nighttime positions. Their enormous shapes are barely distinct now against the darkening tree line. Large, soft masses of shadow, moving with the slow certainty of their own weight. Their breathing, when you are close enough to hear it, is deep and regular and somehow immensely reassuring. The sound of things too large to be hurried by anything the world can offer. Along the river, the last light on the water has deepened from gold to a dark, glassy pewter. The reed beds have gone silent. The first stars are visible now, the genuine stars, not the last light of day, but the true stars, emerging as the sky blackens and the full depth of the universe makes itself known through the narrowing window of the atmosphere. More of them now than you can see in any modern sky, because there are no lights below to wash them out, no human civilization sending its bright confusion upward. Just the stars, in their full undimmed multiplicity, and below them the Jurassic world arranged in darkness, the plain and the river and the forest and the ancient sea beyond, all of it resting now, all of it settling into the deep quiet of the Jurassic night. A meteor crosses the sky. A brief silent stroke of light from east to west, there and gone before you can quite decide you saw it. The stars continue. A warm breeze comes up from the south, carrying the smell of the delta, of warm water and ancient vegetation. The cycad grove where the ankylosaur sleeps stirs gently in this breeze, its fronds making a soft, papery sound that is almost like rain. Somewhere in the forest an animal calls. A long, low, resonant call, not a cry of alarm, not a hunting vocalization, but the kind of call that large animals sometimes make in the night for reasons we do not fully understand. Perhaps a contact call, checking the positions of others of its kind. Perhaps something that has no close human analogue, a vocalization for which we have no good translation. It hangs in the warm air for a moment. Fades. The night holds it, and then releases it, and the silence that returns is deeper for having been briefly interrupted. This is the Jurassic night at its most itself. This is the quality of the world before us, old and patient, and entirely at ease with the fact of its own existence. There is no anxiety here. There is no striving. There is only the ancient ongoing fact of life, eating and resting and breathing and sleeping and waking and going on, generation after generation after generation, in the deep, unhurried confidence of something that has been doing this for a very long time, and intends, without any conscious intention, to continue. Let this be the image you carry into sleep. The Jurassic night, immense and warm and old. The sauropods breathing in the darkness. The river moving on. The stars overhead, exactly where they were tonight, and a million nights before tonight, and a million nights to come. Everything at peace. Everything as it should be. Everything going on. Sleep in the Jurassic world was not different from sleep in our own. This is worth knowing. This is worth sitting with for a moment before you follow the world we have been visiting tonight into the deep, quiet hours. The neurological process of sleep, the slow cycling alternation between different states of rest and processing, the consolidation of experience, the restoration of the body's chemistry, the strange, vivid inner life that manifests as dreams, this is an ancient thing, far older than the Jurassic. The basic architecture of sleep appears to go back at least to the common ancestors of birds and mammals, which means it was present in some form in the theropod dinosaurs that were the ancestors of modern birds, and in the small, warm-blooded mammals that coexisted with the dinosaurs. It may go back further still. The Jurassic world slept. Not all at once. The great communal sleep of a world in darkness is always partial, always layered, with the nocturnal hunters active while the diurnal prey animals rest, with individual animals cycling through their own internal rhythms at their own individual tempos. But in the aggregate, across the whole of the ancient world, the night was a time of rest and restoration, as much as a time of hunting and moving. Something was always sleeping. Something was always dreaming. What the sauropods dreamed of, we cannot know. The neural architecture required for dreaming as we experience it, the rich, narrative, emotionally complex inner life of human sleep, was probably not present in the dinosaur brain, at least not in any form we would recognize. But the body's need for rest, for the cycling of consciousness through different states, for the particular restoration that only sleep provides, this is so fundamental, so ancient, so deeply woven into the biology of complex life, that it seems reasonable to imagine some version of it in these ancient, enormous creatures. Perhaps they experienced something in the quiet behind the closed eyes of a sleeping sauropod, in the darkness behind those large, patient eyes. Perhaps there was something, not narrative, not symbolic, perhaps just the body's chemistry doing its ancient work, the repair and restoration, the slow consolidation of experience into something that would be accessible tomorrow, the deep cellular pleasure of a body doing what it is meant to do when the day is done and the night is full, and there is nowhere to go and nothing to do but be still and let the ancient processes run. If so, it would have been very peaceful. Consider what that sauropod knew as it settled into its resting place on the warm ground of the Jurassic night. It had eaten enormously, its vast gut full of the richly nutritious vegetation of the floodplain. It was warm, the night temperature was comfortable, Perhaps a little cool, but nothing threatening, the ground below retaining the day's heat. Its herd was nearby, the faint sounds and scents of the other sauropods settling into their own rest on all sides, providing the unconscious reassurance of collective presence. There was nothing to do but rest. Nothing required, nothing needed, only the dark and the warm ground and the sound of the other great creatures breathing in the night and the slow, satisfying work of a body that has done a full day's living and is now claiming, with complete justification, its earned rest. This is the gift of the ancient world tonight. The gift of its example. We too have bodies that know how to rest, that are equipped and ready for sleep, that have been doing this every night for as long as we have been alive. The machinery is there, laid down in the deep architecture of our biology, by the same evolutionary process that equipped the sauropod and the small mammal and the fishing Spinosaurus and the patient Ankylosaur with their own versions of rest. We do not need to do anything to sleep. We only need to stop doing. The sauropod did not work at sleep. The small mammal in her burrow did not practice techniques or follow protocols. They simply reached the end of the day and allowed the ancient machinery to engage, the gradual slowing of the heart, the cooling of the core temperature by a fraction of a degree, the shift in neurochemistry that tilts the scale from waking to sleeping, the eyes closing not as an effort but as a release. Trust the machinery. It is far older than you are. It knows what to do. The Jurassic night continues around you now, not as a story to follow, not as something that requires attention, but as a presence, a warm, ancient, enormously patient presence, the sound of the great world breathing in the dark, the steady, slow pulse of the river, flowing on as it has flowed for millions of years toward the sea that has always been waiting for it. The stars overhead, clear and cold and numerous beyond counting, in the same positions they occupied above a Jurassic world that did not know our names and did not need to. The Allosaurus sleeps in her cave. The Spinosaurus rests in the shallows, her enormous body barely buoyant in the warm delta water, her eyes closed, her sail rising and falling with the long, slow rhythm of her breathing. The small mammal in her burrow is a tight warm ball of fur and heartbeat and dreams, if dreams are what they are, her nose tucked under her tail, entirely safe in the darkness. The Ankylosaur breathes in the cycad grove. The sauropods breathe on the plain. The ichthyosaurs drift in the warm, dark sea. Everything rests. Everything in this moment is at peace. Let the breathing of the ancient world become your breathing. Let the deep, unhurried rhythm of the Jurassic night set the tempo of your own rest. Let go of the day, its weight, its complexity, its unfinished business and unresolved questions. Let it go as gently and completely as the sauropod lets go of the afternoon's feeding, when the evening calls it to rest, without drama, without effort, with the simple, complete surrender of a body that is ready, that has been ready for hours, to do what the ancient night asks of it. Sleep now. The world is old. The night is deep. You are safe. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our journey through the ancient Jurassic world. We have walked the great floodplains in the first light of morning. We have stood in the warm delta shallows and watched the patient fisher at work. We have rested in the afternoon sun with the enormous herds. We have moved through the deep, cool forest in the footsteps of small, quick hunters. We have sheltered from the storm and watched the night come down over the plain, and seen the stars emerge above a world that will not know us for another 150 million years. All of it was real. All of it happened. All of those evenings, all of those mornings, all of those resting herds and patient hunters and warm, shallow seas, they all occurred in the deep time that our planet holds as carefully and as completely as memory. The Earth remembers everything. The stone contains it all. And you, wherever you are right now, whatever softness you are resting against, whatever darkness surrounds you, you are part of that long, unbroken story. The same ancient machinery that kept the Jurassic world alive keeps you alive. The same night that fell over the cycad groves falls over you now. Rest in that. Rest in the long, patient, unhurried continuation of life. Rest in the warmth of the ancient world that made you. The sauropods are breathing. The river is moving. The stars are exactly where they should be. And you, dear listener, are exactly where you should be. Sleep now. Good night. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. If you could spend a single peaceful afternoon anywhere in the Jurassic world, on the floodplain with the sauropod herds, in the warm delta watching the Spinosaurus fish, or in the deep forest listening to the ancient trees, where would you choose, and why? Let us know in the comments below.